Good morning and welcome to another Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that He is the Son of a living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you would like more information about how to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, we would encourage you to follow the link in our descriptions. From there, you'll be able to find a full gospel presentation, as well as how to respond to the gospel today and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church, and also online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Elizabethtown area, we would encourage you to still connect with us as we can help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue in our study today, we are going to be in session 2 of our study on the book of Job. Session 2 is titled Hope Defined, and we're going to be looking at Job chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. Again, this is session 2 in our study of the book of Job, titled Hope Defined, and we're going to be looking at Job 14, verses 1 through 14. As we begin our study today, we would like to ask you a question, and as we ask questions throughout this study, we would encourage you to pause the video, and if you are watching this with someone else, to actually have a conversation, talk about these questions and what they mean, and then just whenever you're ready, hit play again. If you are watching by yourself, we would encourage you to get a pen and paper and pause the video at those same times, write some things down, and just give yourself an opportunity to really interact with our study today. The question that we're starting our study with today is this: have you ever attended a sporting event where one team got behind early and appeared to just give up? What emotions did you observe as the contest unfolded? So think about that for a second. Maybe you were watching the Olympics. Maybe you were watching your favorite football, basketball, baseball team, hockey team, whatever it might be, and you saw a game kind of get out of hand very quickly. And to the point that it felt like the other team was giving up. And what emotions maybe did you see from the players? What happened with yourself and all those type of things? And take a couple minutes, write that down, discuss that, and then we'll return to our study. All right, well, you're undoubtedly asking why on earth is that relevant? And if you are a sports fan, or maybe if you're not a sports fan, you can kind of relate to this at some point where you've seen a game get out of hand. I remember in my college days getting the opportunity to drive up to Lincoln, Nebraska to watch the Missouri Tigers take on the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And I was a Tigers fan and got to go up there, and we actually scored the first touchdown. We were very excited because for a fleeting moment we were up 7-0, and that was it pretty much. And very quickly they began to run, and really it became a rout. And you could start to see the frustration on the field as the team was just trying to maybe prevent injury, being strategic. Eventually the other team just started to put in their second, third, fourth string players to give them some playing time. And even the crowds, as you looked around, you saw the Missouri fans leaving early because they had a long drive back to Columbia, Missouri, and there wasn't much left to watch. And so there's certainly an idea of frustration, of regret, of just feeling like things are completely out of control. And there's a reason why we bring that up, because these are going to be some of the emotions that we're going to be experiencing in our study today. The book puts it this way. It says, similar to how players on a team's hopes begin to waver during an overwhelming loss, Job reacted to his circumstances in a very depressed state. Now, if you'll remember, where we ended this last week, Job had been living for the Lord, and God and the enemy, Satan, begin to have this dialogue about Job and how faithful he is and how steadfast he was and what a righteous man he was. And the enemy basically makes the accusation that the only reason that he is faithful to you is because he has flourished under God's provision. And so he says, if you take away all of that, if you take away all of the good things, if you take away all of his wealth and all of the things that show he's blessed, he won't follow you anymore. And so God allows it. God says, fine, do it, but don't kill it, but you're not allowed to touch him. And so Satan swoops in, literally takes all of his wealth, takes his children, takes everything he has in a matter of minutes, it seems like. And suddenly Job is found with nothing but himself, his wife, and his home. And everything else has been taken away. Everything else has either been destroyed or stolen. And in his response to that is to mourn, certainly, but to still worship God. And he says, basically, I trust God no matter what. And he doesn't sin against God in this thing. Well, this leads Satan back to return back to the presence of God. And God steps up again and says, you did this to Job, and he remained faithful. And the enemy again comes out and goes, well, he only stays faithful because you kept his health. Material things, maybe he just didn't value those things that much. But if you touched his body, if you made him suffer pain, agony, he would curse your name. And so God again says, fine, very well. You can touch his body, you can cause him pain, but you do not have permission to kill him. And so he does, and from the top of his head all the way to the bottom of his feet, he is overcome with boils and sores, with pain and discomfort, and he finds himself to the point where he is sitting in sand or in dirt, and he is cleaning his wounds and cleaning his sores with just a piece of broken pottery to keep all the oozing and the grossness off of him, and he is in absolutely horrible straits. And yet, in the midst of all this, he does not curse God, but he continues on. And then shortly thereafter, he has 3 friends that we're going to hear about here a little bit that come to check on him. They hear that he's been going through hard times, they hear that he's suffering, and so they go to check on him. And the moment they see him, they're just in awe. And so they tear their own clothes and they pour ashes, they throw dirt on themselves, and they just go and they sit with Job. And it says that they just sat with him for 7 days. Until finally Job begins to talk. And then when Job starts to talk, then they start to talk back. And between, roughly about Job chapter 3 all the way to Job chapter 12, we have this discourse between Job and his friends. And his friends are trying to give him advice. And to be honest, if you were to read those passages, you would probably generally agree with what they're saying. You would think that their advice was good advice. And yet Job continues to contend against him. He says, what you're saying is not true. Instead, what you're saying, because you're telling me that I must have done something wrong, I must have sinned, I must be receiving all of this hardship because I've done something because of my sin, and I'm telling you that's just not the case. I don't even know what he says. He says, I'm not going to plead my case before God because I already know that I don't compare to him. I don't compare to him in any way, shape, or form, but I've not done anything wrong. And what we find ourselves happening in Job chapter 14, as we see the end of a much larger kind of explanation that Job gives in response to some of his friends. I want to read just a little bit from the book here, and it says, Job desired to stay faithful to the end, but all 3 of his friends rebuked him. Zophar, which was one of the friends, even called him a hypocrite for claiming that he was innocent of his charges. Job poured out his heart in prayer, imploring God to stop persecuting him. And he told his friends that that they couldn't help, that they should remain silent because the matter was between Job and God. In today's study, we're going to examine a portion of Job's prayer as he turns to God for hope in his depressing circumstances. So that's kind of the main thing here, is seeing how in this awful, awful situation, how he ultimately turns to God for hope in the midst of this. So let's get started looking at our passage today. We're going to be in Job chapter 14, starting in verse 1, and let's read verses 1 through 6. And as we do so, I want you to look for the clues of Job's state of mind. So let's read this. It's starting in verse 1 of Job chapter 14. It says, Anyone born of woman is short of days and full of trouble. He blossoms like a flower and then withers. He flees like a shadow and does not last. Do you really take notice of one like this? Will you bring me into judgment against you? Who can produce something pure from what is impure? No one. Since a person's days are determined and the number of the months depends on you, and since you have set limits that he cannot pass, look away from him and let him rest, so that he can enjoy his day like a hired worker. So when we start to think about what is his mindset, what is his kind of emotional state here, he is pleading with God and basically saying, God, my life, life is short. Life is so short. He uses these imageries in the book. And the first, you want to think about the two images. The first one he uses is a flower. And if anybody knows anything about flowers, if you've ever had a garden or grown flowers, you know that they're temporary. Most flowers only bloom for a season. You plant them and they begin to grow up, and then you see the buds start to form, and then shortly you start to really look like a flower, and then it blooms, and then it's only going to bloom for so many days or so many weeks, and then it begins. Then you start to see it wilt, and you start to see it die, and eventually the leaves fall off and the plant is no more. And oftentimes that cycle can be anywhere from just a mere matter of days to really just maybe a handful of weeks, just a few weeks. And what was planted and was beautiful for a season, there's no question about it, is suddenly gone and has almost disappeared without a trace. And that's what he's comparing life to. He's saying, listen, life is so short. And even if we kind of really took the analogy pretty far, it's a beautiful thing, but it's a temporary thing. We'd have to acknowledge that there's only so much. Then he uses the idea of a shadow, and a shadow, just like a flower, is extremely temporary. When we think about our shadows, when we think about shadows in general, they come and go with the day. And as the sun rises, you might see your shadow casted. And if we stood in one spot and just watched our shadow from sunrise to sunset, you'd see it just makes a circle around the person and then eventually fades off into the darkness of night. And these are the illustration and the analogy, and the thing he's trying to communicate here is life is so short. And because life is short, he's asking God, why when life is so short, why would you bring this into my life and make me go through this season of suffering when my life is already so limited and so short, and now you're even taking joy out of what little life I have? There's a question to ask you guys here. This is one to pause the video with, and it's this: how does reflecting on the relatively short duration of human life cause a person to consider some of the greater questions of life? So that's what Job is doing, right? Job is looking at this question. He says, life is so short. Why do you make it full of suffering? Why do you bring suffering into our lives when it's already so short? And so we want to ask the question, why does reflecting on the brevity, the shortness of life, cause a person to consider some of the greater questions of life? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll return to our study. All right, this is really a great question. And when we begin to think about this, kind of a philosophical question, when we really begin to think about, life is so short, we're going to start asking ourselves, well, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose? Why have I been given, and I'm going to come at this from obviously a follower of Jesus and a believer in God, why has God given me these 60, 70, 80, who knows how many years on this planet? And in reality, in the grand scheme of history, is not much. And what am I supposed to do with that? What is the meaning? What does it mean to have lived this life successfully? And when we think about how short life is and yet how long history is, we begin to wonder, why am I here? And it's just and I think if we lived forever and if we lived years and years and years, we may not necessarily think that way. But because we are only given such a small amount of time, and indeed we know that our time is limited on this planet, we begin to wonder, how do I make the most of this time? And I think it's a natural question. I think it's a good thing. When we think about how short life is, and a lot of times when we are confronted with death, it's good for us to ask these hard questions. That's why it's good for us to do things like have gospel messages at funerals, because these are people that are thinking about the fact that life doesn't last forever. I want to focus in on verses 3 through 6 here. And as we look at these verses, we see some kind of rhetorical questions here. And it says, these are the three questions. It says, do you really take notice of one like this? Will you bring me into judgment against you? And what can produce something pure from what is impure? And we see these are kind of rhetorical questions, and they ultimately end with the answer in verse 4, which is no one. And so the first question is, do you really take notice of one like this? And I think the answer is, yeah. God does know his people, and God does know, in fact, everyone that under creation. Will you bring me into judgment against you? And I think, again, the answer is, yeah. that God has every right to judge and to deal with people as he sees fit. That's a crazy thing to think about, but God has every right to do with you whatever he wishes. And whether that means bringing you into judgment or growing you or refining you or sifting you or whatever it might be, he has every right to do that. And then the last one, for who can produce something pure from what is impure? And the answer is no one. And this is just Job acknowledging his sin, and he's just saying, listen, my sin is just. I know that, remember, he was referred to even by God as a righteous one, but that didn't mean he was completely without sin. It meant that his faith was solid and his trust in God was unwavering. And so he's even asking this question, like, I think that there's almost a question of what am I supposed to gain from this? Are you purifying me this? And these afflictions seem so overwhelming. Are you trying to make me perfect? And he goes, because I don't think you can. I don't think you can make perfection from something that is impure. I want to read what the book says. It says, Job recognized he was a sinner, which is what I mentioned, before an almighty God. He realized that except for God's grace and mercy, that he was hopeless. And Job's petition to God was to grant him rest from his sufferings. And that's pretty much what we've talked about. He's recognizing, listen, I am a sinner. I deserve judgment. I am nothing compared to you. I am unworthy of this. But why are you doing this? Why is this going on? This leads us to a question that I want you to pause the video and write about and discuss. And it's this. Why is it good to raise the greater questions of life to God in the face of suffering? That's a great question. Take a couple minutes and discuss that. Why is it good to raise the greater questions of life to God in the face of suffering? Pause the video and then we'll return after you've answered this question. All right, so hopefully you've had some good dialogue about this, about why it's important. And I just want to kind of just add a little thought to that is it's important to do that with God as opposed to with other people. Because when you're going through suffering, unfortunately, a lot of times when we are going through hard times, when we're going through suffering, we don't necessarily go to the Lord in prayer and in time and fellowship with Him. Unfortunately, we go to other human beings and try to see if other human beings can apply meaning to our suffering, can give us the what you should have done, what you should do, and all those things. And oftentimes that wisdom, like we see in Job, falls short. Job's friends show up and start giving him all this advice, and we would even look at that advice and say, yeah, that's pretty solid. But the reality was it wasn't godly. It wasn't the wisdom. It wasn't what God would have wanted them to communicate to them and want them to learn. And I think we do that all the time too. We go to people and they may give us good advice, but that good advice is not godly advice. And because it's not godly advice, often it can lead us down paths and lead us into practices and habits that ultimately don't honor God and don't glorify Him at all. Let's continue in our study. Let's look at Job chapter 14, verses 7 through 12. And as we do, I want you to listen for the contrast that Job presents between nature and people. It sounds like a weird thing, but I want you to just follow along with me. And it says this. It says, there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its shoots will not die. If its roots grow old in the ground, and its stump starts to die in the soil, the scent of water makes it thrive and produce twigs like a sapling. But a person dies and fades away. He breathes his last. Where is he? As water disappears from a lake and a river becomes parched and dry, so people lie down and never rise again. They will not wake up until the heavens are no more. They will not stir from their sleep. So we see two comparisons here. And first we see this kind of idea of a tree. And I don't know if you've ever done this. Maybe you've had, this is my experience, maybe you've had a tree on your property that you cut down because you didn't want it there because it wasn't where it's supposed to be, or you didn't even plant it, that some, I don't know, Bradford pear sent off its seed and ended up in your yard, and next thing you knew you had this Bradford pear growing where it shouldn't have been growing. And so you go and you cut down and you go to the kind of the base of the tree and you cut off the tree and throw it out. And then you go about your life, and then suddenly you realize maybe a year later or whenever that suddenly that tree that you chopped down suddenly has new shoots coming out of it, and that it's starting to grow up again. I actually have a tree in my backyard. I don't know what kind of tree it was, but I know it wasn't supposed to be there. And so I got a chainsaw and I went and I cut down this tree and got it totally chopped up and disposed of about a year ago. I think. And I thought, and I cut it almost all the way down to the ground, but I left the stump. I didn't cut down the whole thing. And I thought, well, that'll take care of it. And wouldn't you know, this year as I'm, mowing my yard and looking out, I realized that tree is still there. That tree is now grown up again. It's about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. Looks more like a bush, but it's not supposed to be there. And even though I had chopped down this tree and I thought I had, killed this tree, it's now back because its roots and because of the way that the tree was structured, it was able to grow back from what I left behind. And Job is making that analogy. He says, but that's not how people are. People cannot be cut off. People cannot die, be struck down, and then just grow up again. That when they are killed permanently. And then he makes this analogy. He says it's not like a tree. It's more like water of a lake that has then been dried up and because of a drought or whatever is ceased to exist. And to the point that maybe at one point there used to be water here. Maybe at one point there used to be a lake here. But now that lake is gone. Now that water has ceased to exist and it is gone. And he says, and that's what it's like for humanity. When we die, it is over. That was the general view of people at this time. You have to understand this is before we start to get a lot of clear teaching, especially, even in the Old Testament, about the idea of an afterlife, of eternity, of a resurrection, one that is very well fleshed out in the New Testament, of the idea that we die, but that we have the hope of the resurrection and going to be with the Father, even after death. The words of Jesus that said, I am the resurrection and the life, and he who believes in me, even though he dies, he will live. Those words had not been spoken yet. And so in Job's time and in Job's culture, his understanding was that when you die, you die. And they even used a term for it. They called it Sheol, which is what we would understand as the grave. And when you die, you go to the grave, and that's where you stay, and that there's no other opportunity for you. There's a question here from the book that I want you to pause the video and discuss, and it's this. How does Job show us the importance of looking at life from God's perspective rather than our own? Now that's kind of a crazy question that I want you to kind of look at. But when we look at this passage and we think about this, how does Job show us it's important about looking at life from God's perspective rather than our own? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll explain the question a little bit. Okay, so the question was asked is, how does Job show us the importance of looking at life from God's perspective and rather than our own? And a lot of times when we look at the world from our own perspective, we might look at the world from our own perspective and say, well, either A, we've got all the time in the world, which Job has already dealt with, but when we look at it from God's perspective and we understand that there is an afterlife and we understand that there is a life after death, that there is hope after death, we recognize that this mentality that Job is presenting is wrong. And because Job is very much so looking from human perspective. And he says, listen, I'm only given so many years on this earth. My life will only make so many trips around the sun. And when it's over, it's over. And so why do I have to go through suffering when I've already have such a short amount of time? And if we look at the world that way, and if we look at the world from man's perspective in that regard, what we will find is we're going to live very selfishly. And we're going to be very pleasure-seeking, almost hedonistic in that one. We're not going to look to our greater purposes and all that stuff. And we're going to recognize that life has no meaning, so I might as well enjoy it. And we're going to be horribly selfish, pleasure-seeking people. But when we do look at it from God's perspective, and we do recognize that we have eternity in mind, and that there is going to be a judgment, that there is going to be a resurrection, that how we live in this life does matter, not just for this life, but for all eternity, then we're going to make decisions that are different. We're going to love people sacrificially. We're going to follow the Lord and seek His good. We're going to bring glory to God into His kingdom, and it's going to be a very, very different thing. The book says, having faith in God does not always mean having the answers to our questions, but it means taking our questions to God, who does have all the answers. It means trusting God in spite of the fact that His providential wisdom, God in spite of the fact that in His providential wisdom, He has chosen not to reveal to us all that He is doing. Now that is a powerful statement that I think we need to just pause on for just a second. Having faith in God is not about having all the answers. Having faith in God is not about demanding all the answers from God. Having faith in God is trusting God even when He withholds the answers from us, and even when His sovereign plan and His idea of what's going to happen does involve our suffering and our sorrow. If you think about where Job is right now, he has no idea what God has in store for him. And even then, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around why everything Job is going through, and ultimately the loss of family. His sons and daughters are not coming back. Why that might be necessary in the grand scheme of things. And so he doesn't get to know that, but, and I really truly believe this, he remains faithful to God and trusting in God, that even though he doesn't have all the answers, that God is ultimately good and going to take care of him. This leads us a question for you guys to discuss and pause the video, which is this: how does keeping our eyes on Christ and His gift of eternal life help us overcome feelings of despair? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll return to our study. All right, hopefully you've had some good answers there. I want to finish up our time together in our last passage. We're going to be looking at Job 14, those last few verses in 13 and 14. And as we do this, I want you to try and pick out the transition that Job makes here from the despair that he's been really talking about this whole time to an inclination that there might be hope, that there's still hope in his heart from God. And so this is verses 13 and 14. Yes, it says this: if only you would hide me in Sheol and conceal me until your anger passes. If only you would appoint a time for me and then remember me. When a person dies, will he come back to life? If so, I would wait all the days of my struggle until my relief comes. So we hear it there, don't we? We see kind of this idea that he's saying, oh, I just wish I could get through this. And he even kind of says it in an interesting way. He says, oh, I wish I could die. I wish I could die and go to the grave where the trouble and the pain and the sorrow of this world couldn't find me. And then when your time of judgment had passed, that you would bring me back from the dead. And then that way I would be able to kind of escape these things. So the book says, Job asserted that he could hope in a resurrection from the dead. If he could hope in the resurrection of a dead, that he would wait on God until his relief would happen. So if there was a resurrection, if there was life after death, then that's what he would ultimately want, and that would be his goal. This leads us to one of our last questions of the study. It's this: why is putting one's hope in God the only reliable way to face feelings of despair? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll return to close out our study. All right, so the question is, why is putting one's hope in God the only reliable way to face the feelings of despair? And the answer for that is because He's there. He's in the future. He's in the past, that God is with us, that He goes before us, and that He'll never leave us nor forsake us. It's one of my favorite lines from the book of Deuteronomy. And the reality is if we will trust in God, even in times of despair, we will remember that He may not remove us from the suffering, but that He will go with us through the suffering, and that He will get us to the other side, even if that other side is eternity with Him in heaven and in the New Jerusalem and the new earth and the new heavens. And we have that hope, we have that trust. And so when we look at this life and the suffering and the challenges we face in this life, it's easy to despair. It's easy for us to say, what's the point of it all? Why go through all of this? But if we look to God and we trust in the Lord and in His sovereignty and believe that His promises are sure and that eternity is a reality for us, then we can survive whatever may come in this life, knowing that eternity will be much, much better. As we close out our study, it says this. It says, in this portion of Job's prayer we examined today, he progressed from questioning despair to expressing his hope for eternal life. The righteous in their resurrected and glorified bodies will receive their reward and will dwell forever in heaven with God. And it closes with a verse from 1 John. And I just want to read that for you real quick and then ask you a closing question. In 1 John 2, verse 28, we read these words: "So now, little children, remain in Him, so that when He appears, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before Him at His coming." There is a reality that Christ is coming back, and he is either going to come back for you individually when your time on this earth is over, or he is coming back here to establish his kingdom, to create that new heaven and that new earth. And so we can have hope and we can have confidence in that we, if we will give our lives to Christ, if we will trust in him, that our eternity will be secure regardless of whatever trials that we may have. Let me close it with this question, and it is this: how does this hope help us even today? How does hoping in eternity help us today? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, close your time in prayer, and then join us for worship at 11 o'clock right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. You can be with us in person or find us online at Facebook Live. Thank you so much. We hope you're doing well. God bless.